Welcome everyone to this annual lecture of DLD, that is Development Leadership Dialogue Institute. We were set up about 2 years ago with generous donation from Hyundai Motor Group of South Korea. We've been basically trying to bring people from different segments in the development community, if you like. There is, of course, a lot of debate, dialogue, discussions, but we tend to talk to people who are similar to each other. So government people talk to other government people, NGOs gather together to talk to each other. So our institute has been trying to bring people from different segments of the development community, national governments, international organizations, private sector, civil society, in the academia, and so on. And we have been organizing different types of activities. So one of the things that we do most frequently is called the Future Leaders Program, which bring people who have, say, 10, 15 years of experience and will be in international leadership positions in different segments of society in the next 5 to 10 years. We organize conversations on individual topics. I'm sure that some of you have been to some of them. The last one we did was on inequality. We are going to do one on the basically illicit financial flows in June. And the jewel in the crown of our activities is this annual lecture, which Joe has kindly agreed to give this year. This is the second one. We tried to get him for the first one, but he was too busy. So, but yeah, I mean, after the 2 years of effort, we have managed to bring him here. At this point, people would say Joe Stiglitz doesn't need an introduction. But I think that's one of the most stupid things to say, because then you have to shut up, yeah? Because if he doesn't need it, why do you introduce him, yeah? So I'm not going to do that. Joe is, he basically changed the face of economics in the last 40 years. In the 70s and 80s, he wrote a series of revolutionary papers in economics using this idea of asymmetric information. Yeah, the Nobel Committee was stupid enough to give him the prize with 2 other people, but I think he should have got it on his own. I got to know Joe about 30 years ago when he was the chief economist at the World Bank. I mean, he rocked the world by writing this book, Globalization and its Discontents, during the time where the World Bank, the chief economist was criticizing the International Monetary Fund for mishandling the Asian financial crisis. So that was quite a refreshing thing. But what makes Joe different from everyone else is that he has no kind of pretension. I mean, what I found most amazing in Joe is that I've been to many conferences with him, and for him, it doesn't matter who's speaking. I mean, it could be a lowly teaching assistant or another Nobel Prize winner, but he will listen to someone who has better ideas. Yeah? So that very often he's listening to this graduate student when other kind of luminaries are hovering around to catch his attention. So that he's a unique human being in that sense. And today's talk is called The Road to Freedom, Economics and a Good Society, National and Global Perspective, which is based on his book published last year. And as some of you, well, at least older people will immediately recognize this is a direct the counter to Friedrich von Hayek, his book Road to Serfdom. Yeah? Now, Hayek actually is quite a profound thinker. Yeah? He's a bad man, but he is very profound. But the book is based on, I mean, his book is outdated in the sense that the image of the economy he has is basically from the 17th century. Yeah? I mean, there's no big corporation, there's no trade union, it's a bizarre idea. I mean, he will find the world of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke more familiar than today's world. And also his the view is very, very narrow in the sense that all he cares about is the right of people who own property to freely use that property to make money. Yeah? I mean, that's the most important freedom for him, which is why he openly advocated the General Pinochet when he staged a coup d'etat and kicked out Salvador Allende. Yeah? Because he thought, I mean, frankly, Allende was not that left-wing, yeah? But he thought even a tiny infringement of the rights of the landlords and other property people was so offensive that it justified bombing the presidential palace from the fighter plane and killing 3,000 people. So Joe's book is a direct counter to that, based on an understanding of this world. He's in a way the DLD personified, yeah? Because he is of course a renowned academic, but he worked in national government, multilateral institutions, and many other areas. So that his work is based on kind of the deep understanding about the real world. And of course, that based on a much more kind of sophisticated philosophical and ethical position. So it's really my great honor and pleasure to host him for this talk. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. As Ha-Joon said, I'm going to talk about, in general, topic, the road to freedom. And I'm going to cover three issues. One of I'm going to begin with a discussion of some very general principles. Then I'm going to move to talk about some global perspectives. This is a school where you're focusing on these global issues, and I'm going to try to make some parallels. And finally, because you are a school, I'm going to talk about academic freedom, because as some of you may know, there is an attack on academic freedom, and my university, Columbia, happens to be at the epicenter of that particular storm, which I do believe we will weather, but I want to spend a few minutes on that. So, as Ha-Joon pointed out, the book is a riff on Hayek's book titled, The Road to Serfdom, and the right has, for a very long time, tried to capture the concept of freedom, to get a property rights, the notion of freedom. And you see that reflected in the United States, for instance, in the extreme right-wing caucus of the Republican Party calls themselves the Freedom Caucus. And as I'll try to explain, that they're devoted to taking away the freedom of as many people as they can. What I wanted to do in writing the book was, in part, to recapture the freedom agenda for the progressives, and to argue that the right really didn't understand the concept of freedom, and that those of us on the progressive side have actually been long committed to the idea of expanding, in a meaningful sense, freedom for most people in the most meaningful way. So that is what, in some ways, it motivated my writing the book, and I'll give a little bit of context, a little of why I wrote it just now, a little bit later. But to go back to understand what motivated Hayek, he wrote the book in 1944, and he wrote it because he was afraid that the increasing role that the government, the state, was taking was setting the world on a path to authoritarianism. We call it the road to serfdom. The reason the role of government had expanded in the previous decade were two. One, the market economy didn't work very well beginning with the Great Depression. It was pretty clear that the market on their own were not stable, efficient, self-correcting. 1 out of 4 people, 1 out of 5 people, depending on the country, were unemployed. And there were people who said, oh, just leave it to the market, and eventually the market will correct itself. That might be true, but it might be another 50 years, and people didn't want to grow up in poverty, unemployment. So it was very clear that in the relevant time span, the market was not self-correcting. Keynes put it very well when people said, oh, just leave it to the market, it will be self-correcting. In the long run, Keynes' response was, in the long run, we're all dead. And that really captured the nature of that aspect of the debate. But it was also the case that in Scandinavia, there was the beginning of the welfare state. Actually, even earlier in Germany, Bismarck introduced Social Security. And in the UK, there were discussions. Beveridge was writing about creating the idea of creating a national health service. Today, that idea is not radical, just like Social Security, old age pensions provided through the government is not radical, except for the Republican Party in the United States. But for most places, accepted that that is an important role for government, and government can do it more efficiently than the private sector. But the worry was, this was before the National Health Service, that expansion would lead to more government, and that would set Europe, UK on the road to serfdom. Well, looking back 80 years later, it's very clear that the growth of authoritarian populism, you see that growth not in countries where the government has done too much. You don't see it as much in the Nordic countries as you do in the countries where the government has done too little, and in places where the government has done too little. So where do you see the worst manifestation of this kind of populism in the United States? It's in the red states. It's where the states have not done enough to retrain people to respond to deindustrialization. What you see, these are the places in the United States where life expectancy is in marked decline. Life expectancy, here in the United States, where we have real success in advancing innovation in medicine. We know how to extend people's lives. And yet, in large parts of the United States, there are really very large declines in life expectancy. And I use that as a real sign of societal dysfunction because it doesn't happen very often. And the one context where I saw that happening very dramatically was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where everybody had said, not everybody, but that moving from communism to a market economy was supposed to increase standards of living. And it didn't seem to be happening. And we were getting GDP numbers that said the GDP was down by 1/3. And everybody said, oh, no, that can't be true. The market economy is supposed to raise incomes. It can't be going down. And we weren't sure the numbers added up. But when we were getting demographic data, which is much more reliable, that life expectancy was going down very quickly by years, that we knew that things were not working very well. So idea behind Hayek and Milton Friedman, who wrote another book called Capitalism and Freedom. The reason I mention this is economists have weighed into the subject for a very long time. John Stuart Mill wrote another very influential book in the middle of the 18th century called On Liberty. And there's a very natural reason the economists weighed in, which I hope will be clear by the time I'm through. But I'm looking at these obviously very deeply philosophical issues very much through an economist lens. These economists, Hayek, Friedman, believe that the market would lead to economic efficiency and, in some sense, broader prosperity. There's a really fundamental differences between Friedman and Hayek. In many ways, as Ha-Joon suggested, Hayek was a deeper thinker, although living not in the same world, than Friedman. Hayek had a sort of an evolutionary perspective on the world, and just it was sort of a holdover from social Darwinism and the idea that somehow evolution was going to raise standards of living. We now know that there's no teleology in evolution. There was no analysis. It was just a religious belief and a metaphor based on Darwin's earlier work. But analysis in the last 20, 30 years, to which I've contributed, has explained why evolutionary processes often don't work and work in ways that lead to economic efficiency. But Friedman was much more simplistic, and Friedman's was part of standard equilibrium analysis that goes back to kinds of models of Ra and had been really definitively analyzed by Arrow and DeBrew in the late 50s, early 60s, in worlds where there was perfect information. And Arrow and DeBrew had shown that the conditions under which markets were efficient were extraordinarily restrictive. And then I came along with my colleague, Bruce Greenwald, and what we showed is that whenever information was imperfect, asymmetric, or risk markets were incomplete, that markets, and those are always, markets were almost never efficient. And the way I put it, in contrast to Adam Smith had said, the pursuit of self-interest would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. We put it that the reason the invisible hand often seems invisible is because it's not there. And try to articulate why things don't work out in a way conducive to economic efficiency. But these, advocates of markets not only believed that they were efficient, but also that they were in some sense fair. And that was where a lot of the ideas of neoclassical, neoliberal economics came in, where the work of John Stuart Mill came in. And that was the theory of just deserts, that everybody got compensated according to their contribution to society. And my predecessor as in the Drummond chair at Oxford, NASA Senior, was famous for his theory about why capitalists got the return. And I always loved the name. It was called the abstinence theory. They got compensated for not consuming and for abstaining from consumption. And the high returns to capital were a reward for that. I think there's always been an alternative theory that the reason they get compensated so well is not just because of their marginal contribution, but because of their market power. And that's a kind of theory that is encapsulated in theories of exploitation. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But the people like Friedman and the Chicago School had the idea that markets are always efficient. They might lead to some people doing better than others, but don't worry, because trickle-down economics is going to make sure that everybody benefits. And let me make it clear, there never was a theory behind trickle-down economics, and there never was much evidence for trickle-down economics. And now I guess there's some evidence for trickle-up economics, and our current administration in Washington is working very hard to make sure money trickles up. Part of my book is to try to articulate and to try to explain why it is that, in general, markets don't succeed in being efficient, and why they generate such inequality in the absence of government intervention. But most of the book picks up on the theme of freedom and what we should mean by freedom, and why in some ways it's such an important economic concept. So let me begin by talking about the economist's natural form of thinking about freedom. It's really the freedom to do what we can do. Somebody who is at the point of starvation doesn't really have freedom. He does what he has to do to survive. And what we mean by having more freedom is expanding your opportunity set, what your choices, what you can do. And that's really what we should be thinking about when we talk about expanding freedom, expanding people's capacity, ability to live up to their potential, to expand what the set of things that they can do. Now, there are two fundamental ideas, or more than that, but two fundamental ideas that I want to talk about this evening. The first is that in this arena, there are few absolutes. We live in a closely integrated society, and that means expanding the freedom of some individuals may come at the expense of contracting the freedom of others. And that means there are trade-offs, and that's part of the reason why this is naturally within the purview of economics. Economics talks about trade-offs all the time. Isaiah Berlin, who was a great philosopher at Oxford, put it more poetically than I did when he said, freedom for the sheep has often meant, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. And translate that into economics, so many examples, freedom to carry around all the time an AK-47, which some people on the right in the United States believe is a fundamental right of every human being. And if you take away the right to carry around an AK-47, you're taking away somebody's fundamental right. Well, that has meant that almost every day in the United States, there's a mass murder, including, every other day, a mass murder at a school. And what does that mean? The freedom to carry an AK-47 around has taken away the freedom of many other people to live. And you asked the question, what is more fundamental, the freedom to carry an AK-47 or the freedom to live? And most people, I think most reasonable people, would say the freedom to live is more important. But there are other freedoms that carrying an AK-47 takes away. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of our great presidents, gave a very influential speech called The Four Freedoms, talking about political freedoms, but also economic freedoms. But one of the freedoms he talked about was freedom from fear. And children today in American schools live in fear. When I was a kid, we had to learn what to do in the case of responding to an air raid siren of a nuclear war. We lived under the shadow of nuclear war, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was sort of the real moment where we really felt it. But today, children throughout our country are trained regularly on what to do when a gunman comes into the classroom. How to dive under the desk, how to be quiet. And they live under constant fear. And parents don't know whether their children will come home from school because a gunman can come into the classroom. So that's a graphic example of the trade-offs in freedoms. One of the things that motivated me to write the book is what happened during the pandemic, where we had a lot of debates about these trade-offs in freedom. It was very clear that the spread of the pathogen of COVID-19 was affected by social distancing, by wearing masks, and by vaccination. But large numbers of people on the right said making us do those things was an infringement on their freedom. But not doing that, not being vaccinated, not wearing masks, meant that other people would get the disease. Many of them would be hospitalized. and some of them would die. So what was more important? The freedom of somebody not to be inconvenienced by wearing a mask, or somebody's right to live or right not to be hospitalized? Well, again, it seemed to me any reasonable discussion would say, unless you have some reason not to get vaccinated, like a health, and there are some exceptions, or some reason not to wear a mask, the presumption should be the freedom to live and freedom not to be hospitalized was more important than the freedom not to wear a mask. We could go through, a whole list of things of this kind. Milton Friedman, with his wife, wrote a very influential book called Free to Choose. And I said that the really correct name of that book was Free to Exploit. Because what he wanted to do was strip away regulations that protect the environment, to protect individuals, consumers from being exploited by firms, workers to be exploited by their employers. So we live today in a world in which there are large amounts of market power, particularly strong in the United States, worse in the United States. And the evidence of this is overwhelming now, that there are strong centers of market power which affect the way our economy behaves and affect the way economic policy in turn affects our economy. So we live the competitive model. I hope none of you have wasted your time studying the competitive model in your courses. That's a world that may have existed, never really did exist, but was more closely approximated decades ago, but certainly a world in which perfect competition doesn't provide a good description of today's economy. It's an economy rife with market power. Just as a footnote, a lot of people in Europe look across the Atlantic and say, "Oh, you're doing so well in America. You have all these trillion-dollar companies. We don't have any trillion-dollar companies. And so you're doing something right, we're doing something wrong." And my response to that is the existence of these trillion-dollar companies is proof that we're doing something wrong. Because if you have competition actually working, what should be the level of profits? Zero. And what should be the present discounted value of zero? It should be very small. The existence of trillion-dollar companies is evidence that we have ineffective antitrust policies. We have ineffective competition policies that has led these companies to get for themselves an enormous amount of money. So the existence of companies like Google, Apple is evidence that our antitrust laws and our competition policies have been very slow to operate. They are beginning to operate. Google's been declared to be a monopoly in several areas. The judge just a couple of weeks ago declared Apple Store to be a monopoly. There are slews of cases going on. So it will be tamed, but very, very gradually. But what is market power? Market power is the power to raise price. What does that mean? It takes money off of consumers and transfers them to the owners of the monopolies, who tend to be very wealthy people. And it's one of the reasons why we have such inequality in the United States, why it's grown so badly in the United States. So it's important to have regulations to stop this kind of exploitation. We also discovered all kinds of exploitation of workers. Some we only discovered because we finally, again, in litigation, we discovered some contracts where they had forced workers to sign agreements that basically took away a lot of their rights. And there's been an attempt to correct that. I can go on, but I want to go on and talk about some other areas. But there's also the exploitation of the environment. And that obviously is giving money to the oil companies at the expense of not only today's generation, but future generations. So the bottom line of all this is that when we start thinking about these freedom, we have to understand that there are these trade-offs, and that the way our society has been making these trade-offs too often has been not what is consistent with maximizing societal welfare, economic prosperity, social justice, but reflects political power, which in turn reflects a lot of economic power in a self-perpetuating way. So that notion of trade-offs and freedoms is the first idea. The second idea I wanted to get across is that sometimes restraints on freedom can expand freedom, sort of a conundrum that, and the kind of idea that I'm trying to get across here is sort of illustrated by traffic lights. A traffic light is a regulation. It says you can't go until it's green. And if you were talking to the right wing in the United States, they would say that's impinging my freedom. You're taking away my freedom. In a free world, you have no stoplights, you have no regulation, and so they're against that. But imagine a world with no traffic lights in London or New York. You would have gridlock. Nobody could move. So a simple regulation, like a traffic light, expands everybody's freedom in a meaningful way, that you have more ability to move. Well, that's a simple idea, but actually is a metaphor for a wide span of choices that we as a society make, that acting collectively, we can, through some restraints, really expand all of our freedom in a meaningful sense. So let me go back to the pandemic, and we wouldn't be here probably today in the same way if COVID-19 hadn't been tamed in some way. And it was tamed largely through the mRNA vaccine. And the mRNA vaccine was built on the mRNA platform. And the mRNA platform was based on, and the application to COVID-19, it was very rapid application. It was done in just months, weeks actually. That development of that whole platform and the application was based on government-funded research occurring at universities and research labs, mostly universities. So then you ask, it takes resources to make those advances in science. It doesn't come for free. But if we're going to have those kinds of advances, we have to have taxes. And taxes are coercion. Most people don't voluntarily pay their taxes. They are coerced. I mean, they do voluntarily in the sense that if everybody else does, they're going to do it, and they don't, they understand. In Finland, actually, 70% of people support paying taxes. And they're enthusiastic because they understand it's the price we pay for civilization. So, but here, a little bit of coercion, paying taxes, has expanded all of our freedom because we now can go about our work, have meetings like this. We recovered from the pandemic, and we could not have done that without public spending. It would never have been done by the private sector on its own. So there are a whole host of things, areas where working collectively through taxes, through cooperation, we can do things that we could not do individually. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes when I come back to talk about the role of academia and academic freedom. But I want to, reiterate what Hajum said. Hayek was living in a world in which people live in their little farms. You don't need public investment. You don't live in cities where you need sewage, you need water. You could have your own little well and your own little farm. That's not the world we live in today. And in our integrated world, you do need large elements of cooperative action. In fact, cooperation is at the core of our economic success. And that is something that the extreme individualism ignores, that we live in a society. What is, in some sense, from an academic point of view, interesting to me is economics is supposed to be a social science. And the word social means what? More than one person. And economics, as it developed with models of Robinson Crusoe, the individual living in his isolated farm, no real interaction, is not a social science. So there's this curious thing that economics for the last 200 years has tried to divorce itself from being a social science. And it's neither social nor science. So what I've been trying to do is make economics both a social and a science. So let me now turn to some of the global perspectives on these issues. Just like we need cooperation within our society, and cooperation needs rules, regulations, so too globally, the basic unit of our global economy is the nation state. And we have to come to understand that success from a perspective of global economy is going to require cooperation, and successful cooperation is going to require restraints. In effect, going back to the theme about there's no absolutes, it means giving up sovereignty. But giving up sovereignty means that in principle, if we do it in a cooperative, collective way, we expand our freedom. Now, we had hoped that the creation of the UN was an expansion of freedom, that we wouldn't have to worry about one country invading another. When you have to worry about one country invading the other, you have to spend a lot of money in military, and that takes away your freedom. And for the countries who are invaded, that of course is taking away their freedom. So what we collectively have tried to do at the UN is to say, we will agree that none of us will invade anybody else, and if they do, we'll all come to aid in some sense of the country that's been invaded. That collective agreement was an attempt to expand our freedom by an international rule of law. It was always violated at the margin, but it wasn't at the margin when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that is, just such a massive violation of the international rule of law that I think the international community needs more strongly to come and defend Ukraine. But most of what I want to talk about is on the economic side, but it's the same basic principle. We have tried to create an international economic rule of law with the notion that through a rule of law, we can cooperate, work together more effectively. We can take advantage of comparative advantage, and benefits of larger scale markets allow us to specialize. We can create a more productive global economy. Well, the hope was that we would have an international rule of law that was based on sound economic principles and fair. But, that was a little bit utopian. It's always been obvious that power matters, both in terms of the writing of the rules, but also in terms of their enforcement. And that the mirage that we had a fair international economic rule of law was in some ways shattered by Trump. But before I conclude this part of the discussion, I want to raise the point, it may turn out, we may come to the conclusion that a somewhat unfair rule of law may be better than the law of the jungle. And that is what we are now confronting. That as unhappy as many of us were with the preceding sets of rules, the fact that there was some degree of compliance, some attempt at reason, is better than a world in which there is no reason and it's just brute power. And I think that issue is going to be a fundamental issue going forward. Whether we can, the approach that many of us had was, yes, we had a bad rule of law, but we were going to work to reform it. And the world was moving towards, hopefully, reform. It's now been shattered. And the question is, where will we go from here? Let me, though, talk a little bit about the ways in which it is now being shattered by Trump, and some of the implications, some of the ironies in what is going on. Trump and Putin have, in many ways, much in common. They're both either authoritarian or would-be authoritarian. Neither understands any notion of rule of law in any way. Many of you may have heard Trump say, if I judge it to be in the interest of the United States, it's legal. So he is wants to be, judge, jury, anything he does, if he says it's good, it's legal. That's not the rule of law. The rule of law is everybody is subject to the rule of law, and you can't that we have laws that every person has to be respect. And that's true both domestically and internationally. Trump has broken agreements that he himself made just a few years earlier. He signed this free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. And one of his first things he did was to say, oh, that was then. Now I'm on my second term, Canada has to pay 25% tariffs. And why your government would believe that signing an agreement with this guy would have any benefit seems to me, it's a little strange, except if you understand it as theater. And on every side, it's not about an agreement, it's about theater, and then you have to evaluate what the nature of the theater is and how that theater is interpreted. So it should be very clear what Trump is. He has a zero-sum view of the world. He thinks anything that is good for any other country comes at the expense of the United States. And so if other countries are doing well, it must be because they cheated and took something away from us. And if you have that zero-sum view of the world, it's a very unpleasant view because everything is conflictual. And it's just the opposite of what economists believe in general, that if we cooperate, we both can be better off. And, I don't know how critical I should be of University of Pennsylvania. They should have done a better job of teaching Trump. But I'm not sure that anybody could have succeeded. So I'm not sure whether I should blame Wharton about this. But there are going to be long-term consequences of, let me say, the fact that Trump says that other countries are taking advantage of us, these are unfair trade agreements, is laughable to anybody who's been participating in global negotiations over the last 20, 30, 40 years, because the global trade agreements were basically written by the United States. And we didn't do it because we were bleeding heart and we wrote it for the advantage of the developing countries. I can assure you, that was not the foremost thing in our mind when we were writing. The most special interest part of the U.S. government has always been the U.S. trade representative, our trade minister. And it was written, these agreements were written for America's corporate and financial interest. Now, where there's a grain of truth is they were not written for the interest of the average American. They were not written for the interest of our workers. They were reflected corporate interests. And so in that sense, there was a dichotomy between American interest and these agreements. But it was the failure of our democracy, not the failure of other countries, that was the basis of the failure of these agreements. You know, I don't know, a digression a little bit about, I was in the Clinton administration when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was being discussed. It had been negotiated by Bush, but he hadn't been able to push it over the line, and we were trying to, discussing getting it ratified by Congress. And Ross Perot, in his presidential campaign against Clinton and Bush, had talked about the giant sucking sound. It was a really, you know, beautiful metaphor that all the jobs would be sucked into Mexico. And the argument that people in the advocates claimed in the Clinton administration was that it would expand trade, it would make American economy stronger, and everybody would benefit. And then I tried to explain, ask the question, explain. Standard economic theory said, even if the country as a whole was better off, the demand for unskilled labor would go down because we would be importing more unskilled labor, intensive goods. And that would, importing goods that were intensive and unskilled labor would decrease the demand for unskilled labor, and that would drive down wages or increase unemployment of unskilled workers. And that's standard economic theory. It was in strong form. Some of you may know this as the Samuelson-Stoper theorem and the factor price equalization theorem. I come from academia, so you know, I said, you know, you can't just, you know, repeal these economic laws. Why are you so confident everybody will be better off? And they said, well, we're not quite sure, but if they are not, we're going to make sure we're going to trade adjustment assistance will compensate them. But then when the Republicans refused to support trade adjustment assistance or any compensation, they still supported this and said everybody's going to be better off, and they went back to trickle-down economics. And I asked, you know, how is this trickle-down economics going to work? And they said, trust us. Well, it didn't happen, as you all know. And now we have actually, one of my colleagues at Columbia has done, with her co-authors, a very good study where they look at those places in the United States, counties, which produced goods that were competitive with the goods that were imported from Mexico. And in those particular places, wages are lower, unemployment is higher, property values are lower. So the concerns about what opening up trade with Mexico would do have been realized. And a similar study was done at MIT with respect to opening up trade with China. So the bottom line that I want to emphasize is that economics actually provided a lot of guidance about what would happen, but ideology prevailed, special interest prevailed over reasoning. And we paid a very high price for that, both in the United States and in other countries. But now that there's this backlash against, neoliberalism has failed, and there's now this enormous backlash, not only in the United States, but in many places in Europe, and worse in the United States with Trump. Trump's tearing up the international rule of economic law will have short-run and long-run consequences. In terms of for the United States, it should be obvious that no one can or should trust an agreement that they make with the United States. And it's even, more deeply disturbing because in 4 years' time, hopefully we'll elect another Democrat good government. But other countries will ask the question, if you can elect Trump twice, why not, maybe not the Constitution, you won't elect him again, and he'll be a little too old. But there are other people in America who are equally bad. He doesn't have a monopoly on stupidity. And he doesn't have a monopoly on being a demagogue. We have a large supply of would-be demagogues. And he's taken a lot of the air out of the other demagogues for the moment. But I assure you, we have the capacity to produce more. And we will produce more. So the answer is, this is going to have very big effects over the long run, not only for the United States, but for the global economic order. I find that this is just as an aside, in some ways remarkable that the dollar has done as well as it has. Because I don't know how many of you have studied the Mar-a-Lago Accord. That is a proposal from the chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors, which has this very interesting, innovative idea that it's a echo back to the 80s of the Plaza Accord, exchange and exchange rates and a realignment. But the most interesting part of it is a proposal that countries exchange their T-bills and short-term bonds for 100-year bonds, century bonds. And to make this exchange of short-term bonds for long-term bonds more attractive, he proposes to pay zero interest on these long-term bonds. So you can get a guaranteed zero interest rate for 100 years. When I was in China not that long ago, in March, I asked some of the Chinese leaders that I met with how enthusiastic they were about exchanging their T-bills that pay low interest rates for zero interest rate 100-year bonds. And of course, they did not have. Oh, I should mention that countries, if any of you have these T-bills, or UK has these T-bills, if you don't agree, guess what is in store for you? More tariffs. Even if you've made an agreement temporarily on a tariff. And if that's not enough, we will withdraw your security guarantee, which of course we've already withdrawn anyway. So at that point, U.S. tariffs were already at 175% or 80% against China. So the threat of more tariffs was not going to be exactly life-threatening. And the withdrawal of the U.S. security guarantee for China was also not exactly a credible threat. So I asked them, what was their reaction, and they said, that's a default. When you force an exchange of bonds for a 100-year bond paying zero, that's another name for default. So the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors was proposing a default. And of course, many of you may remember that at various times, Trump has proposed a default. So it's quite remarkable that the world has as much confidence in the dollar as they do, given the suggestions from various people in the administration of a default. Well, let me finally turn to the question of academic freedom. As I say, there's a lot more to be said about the international context, but and freedom and why we need an international rule of law. The most important message, I guess, we had a discussion this morning about this. The most important message is I think the rest of the world has to get along without the United States. And there needs to be what I call the G-1. The world has to come to cooperate together, because cooperation is essential for climate change, for deal with the next pandemic. And if the United States is being uncooperative, one has to have cooperation among those who are a coalition of the willing, designed to incentivize the United States to cooperate and to be open to the United States when there's a change in administration. So let me turn to the third topic, which is academic freedom. And I want to begin by talking about the importance of academia more generally. Adam Smith in 1776 wrote this very influential book called The Wealth of Nations. And he, as he was writing, couldn't really talk about the source of wealth of the nations in a modern economy. Why? Because at the time he was writing, per capita income had remained roughly constant for centuries before that. The increases in our standards of living, life expectancy, all have occurred since in the last 250 years. And the natural question is, what happened in the last 250 years that separates those 250 years from the centuries that preceded it? And I give a lot of credit to the Enlightenment, of which Adam Smith was a part. And there are just basically two or three ideas that were central to the Enlightenment. One is that progress is possible through science, coming to understand nature through a systematic procedures, ways of learning about nature, and then using that understanding to improve our well-being. Using what we've learned about nature to invent the things that are all around us. And another important part that's sometimes not given, understanding how we cooperate with each other. Understanding social organization. And it's the latter that led to ideas like the rule of law, democracy, really change, in the world before, you sort of inherited the world that you did, and you made little tweaks. But the point of the Enlightenment is that we can actually think rationally about how to structure our society and try to make it work better. so that we can understand the world around us and the world that we create. Those are the basic ideas of the Enlightenment, and a fundamental notion that there is something called truth, that we don't know it for certain, there's uncertainty, but we can learn something about truth. Well, those are, as I say, fundamental ideas that have actually made an enormous difference to the way we live, to our standards of living, to our freedoms, in every respect. One of the important aspects of making societies function is basic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. You know, these basic rights were sort of the outcome of that Enlightenment thinking. And 250 years later, they still are the basic ideas that are fundamental. But one part of that basic right, you might say, is academic freedom. It wasn't put as one of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, which should have been. Why is academic freedom so important? Well, it is part of our societal control mechanism, of the way we, well-functioning institutions, well-functioning corporations, well-functioning, have to think about their successes and their failures, when they're working and when they're not working. And I call that part of our control system. And most people are engaged in the business of doing business, in the business of making things and providing services. We in academia have the luxury of thinking. It is a big luxury. And thinking, full time, teaching, transmitting knowledge and accumulating knowledge. And part of our thinking is thinking about how our society is functioning. And that's what the social sciences are about. And it's, over the long term and over the short term. And that's why we give tenure to our faculty, so that they can not only think, but articulate their ideas, and without fear. In a world of fear, you're afraid to talk about what you think. When I was in the U.S. government and when I was at the World Bank, I was in a luxury position relative to most of my colleagues, because I still had tenure at the time at Stanford University. And being a professor, I thought, was the best job in the world. It's a job I always wanted, and it was the job I had. So the worst that could happen to me was I would go back to being in a better job, which was being a professor. So there was nothing anybody could do that could make me not do what I thought of as my job at the World Bank, which was as an international public servant. I was a servant of the international community. And so, if the Secretary of U.S. Treasury told me something and I thought it was wrong, I could say, you're wrong. And if he tried to get me fired, which at one point they tried, and they eventually succeeded, but I could, it didn't bother me. I felt I had to do my job. And the same thing during the Clinton administration. I tell that story partly because it seemed that is the reason why we have academic freedom, why we have tenure, and why we create these institutions that are really not just peripheral in our society. I believe, we are very central to the functioning of our society. And in many ways, I think the administration, Trump's attack on the universities should be viewed as like a canary in the coal mine. I don't know if you know that metaphor. Okay. Coal mining, I know, is a declining industry. So, and will hopefully be shut down totally pretty soon. But so I'm glad you all know about the canary in the coal mine. So the fact is that the attack on academic freedom is what you expect in authoritarian, and you see all the time in authoritarian regimes, because they don't want criticism. They don't want people to think for themselves. They don't want us to teach the younger generation how to think for themselves. They are angry that a lot of younger people are thinking for themselves and coming up with conclusions that are different from what they like. And so that is why there's such animus against the universities. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It is really about the role of academia in our society. So I think you say I think at Columbia and at Harvard and our other institutions, we are getting together and fighting collectively. I think we will succeed, not only for ourselves, for our principles, but also for our society, for which we play this very important role. I think these fundamental issues should be of importance, of concern to all academia all over the world, because we are a community of scholars all over the world who are engaged in similar fights. I hope you don't have as ugly fight as we are having now, but it should be a warning for what could happen. So on that note, let me open up for questions.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Joe. That was a wonderful talk, delivered with your customary clarity and verve. It was really, really lovely to listen to you. I'm going to play the nasty authoritarian here. I'm going to restrict your freedom to ask long questions and give speeches so that we can free Joe's time up. He's had a very long day for us, and so I can free everybody up to join us for a reception over in the Paul Webley wing, or Webley Stadium, as I call it, over there shortly. But I think we've got a little bit of time, if you're okay with that, to ask questions. If you can tell us briefly who you are and make them questions with a question mark, not long speeches, please. Don't be frightened now. So let me open up. Who would like to? And there's a mic roving. So Laura, yeah.
Thank you very much. If I could just briefly share, recently I was talking to a group of people who are all development studies professors, and we all agreed that it was your book, Globalization and Its Discontents, which started us off on those journeys. So you've definitely had an impact on a lot of people's lives. My question is about, like when you were talking about freedom, you were kind of grounding it within kind of sovereignty and rights. But I wonder what role bargaining power plays in freedom, and particularly differential bargaining power of workers in different countries, what people are able to do for what price. I wonder how you think about that in relation to creating room for freedom. Thank you.
Do you want to just take a little cluster? Yes, go ahead, up there.
Would you say that the actual rules-based order, like the international order, has changed? Or would you say it's more the illusion of it that has shattered for the Global South? Like, in what ways would you say, like, tangibly, that order looks different for the experience of Global South countries, or is it just that illusion that shifted?
Let's take one more, and there's one right near you. Just Enrico, just up there.
Thank you. My name is Umber, and I'm just finishing my master's at LSE, so not SOAS. And I wanted to ask, because we see the fall of international institutions and the failings that they have, especially when it comes to sovereignty, do you think there's a place for decentralized approaches more now than ever, starting from the ground up?
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously, bargaining power is very important. And that's one of the fundamental critiques of the competitive model. And if you were trying to give motives to why that competitive model was sold so strongly, it was try to pretend that nobody had more power than anybody else. It began with the assumption that everybody had zero power. The fact is, bargaining power is important, and from an economic point of view, what is a corollary of that is that efforts to expand bargaining power alter behavior. And you can't understand, to understand a lot of economic behavior, it is directed not only to exploiting existing bargaining power, but directed to increase it. So if you look at a lot of the politics going on, the fight is over whether we should have weaker or stronger antitrust laws. That is should you give more power to Apple and to the monopolies? And they're using their market power to expand their power. So in terms of freedom, that's why one of the important areas of collective action, we're never going to eliminate power. You know, and one of the problems of collective action is the power in collective action, and of some people having more voice than others. But the role of democracy is to try to weaken any single source of power. And one of the things in the latter part of my book that I try to emphasize is that if we're going to have well-functioning societies, like a good society, we have to think a lot about systems of checks and balances, not only within government, which we talk about in political science, but also within society. And that means we can't have too much inequality of wealth, because if we have too much inequality of wealth, it will wind up being reflected in one way or another in inequalities of political power, and that leads to rules that will amplify that power. I think that what Trump has done has clearly torn down the facade of a world in which everybody, a nice convivial world in which we're all working together. I mean, clearly, he's put a very ugly face on what is going on. He's shown that in a way that America can do what it wants with impunity. Hopefully not complete impunity. China showed that, you could threaten China with tariffs, and it responded by imposing tariffs and restricting sales of critical minerals, and showed that it had market power too. So what I think is going to be true, I mean, if this was the big question that I raised in the beginning of my second section of my talk, where I talk about what is the new global order going to be like. I think it's going to be very difficult to reestablish a global rule of law of the kind that we had for the previous 7-8 decades. But I think the turmoil that Trump is creating is actually increasing the appetite for a global rule of law. People don't want to live in this jungle that we are now in. It's just too difficult to operate. So I think we will wind up with a world where we will have I don't know how to describe it. We will probably have a less ambitious global rule of law. We won't try to, we were negotiating, whether you should, what kind of glass plate you should have on cars, and we were trying to specify lots of different standards on lots of different things. There'll be cooperation in trying to set standard setting, but not through standard setting bodies and through more decentralized agreements. But so we will be less ambitious, but we will try to get, I think, frameworks in which we aren't going at the extremes of what is happening now. I don't think international commerce can survive. So we now recognize we don't live in a borderless world. We now realize that power really does matter, and that we had a pretense of everybody playing well together, and I don't think we're going to go back to that in the same way. But I think we will realize that we do need to find some areas of cooperation, like on climate change and on pandemics. It's just so essential to cooperate in, and nuclear armaments. There are a whole host of areas, and that goes to the last question on decentralization. I think there is scope for bottom-up activity, and I think there's scope for lots of work on each of these separate areas, and I think there will be a lot of work on many areas, but on many of the very big issues, like climate change, we can't just leave it to individuals on their own. We have to have global rules, I think, and we have to punish countries that don't do something about climate change. So getting, as an illustration, I think some form of CBAN is a good idea, but the overly prescriptive form, and the form where Europe decided on its own rather than making it part of a global agreement was wrong. And so the idea that you can't allow some countries to pollute at the expense of others is right, but we have to have an agreement that is implementable by all the countries.
Let's very quickly just take maybe a couple more. I know there's a question here, and then we'll take one up there. We wait for the mic, which is about.
Thank you. Ivor Middleton. My question is about change. How do we get meaningful change? Many of the issues that you wrote about in Discontents are still coming up today. You even mentioned some today. Things have not changed. And the things you're talking about, getting the rule of law, a meaningful rule of law, they're not going to happen because we were talking about these 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so the question is, given economic power, in our democracy, how do we get democracy? How do we get change? Thank you
for that. And then we haven't had a question from up there, so we'll just only one, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I believe that universities on the whole are not corrupted. Academics in universities generally are good at what they do, be that thinking about society on the short term, long term, as you say, or whatever else. Politics feels less so. Why are universities successful at achieving their goal? And what single thing or set of things should be done to make politics more effective at putting in place the people who are actually good at their goal?
Great question. Let me say, I think partly because we get paid so poorly, and there's so little money. I think money corrupts. Coming from an economist, that may sound, but weird. But I do think that there is small scale corruption in academia. People, I can describe. I can name people even. No, but the kind of small scale corruption is that editors of journals often make sure that the articles that get published cite them and their friends more often. And the currency in academia is citations. So, in our little currency, there is a little bit of corruption, but it doesn't pale compared to what we're seeing in the political level. I think at the political level, we know we've made a lot of advances in curbing corruption until what just has happened. When I think about the kind of safeguards that were in place when I was in the Clinton administration, I couldn't accept a lunch that was worth more than $20. Before every reception I would go to, it would have to be vetted by somebody in the ethics office. And there were rules, civil rules, but is it stand up or sit down? I mean, you can't believe, but and how much was the spending per capita, per person? There was an attempt of transparency. There are ways that we can limit campaign contributions. The problem, obviously, is the question that was asked in a way at the beginning, political power. The interest groups want to be able to use money to influence. And in the United States, we have a particular problem because the Republicans on the Supreme Court have used the First Amendment as an excuse for corruption. Getting a little bit into American politics, but it does, I think, there was a case called Citizens United where they decided corporations are people. People have the right to free speech, and free speech means money, and therefore curbing money is curbing free speech. So they said it was a violation of free speech to restrict campaign contributions. They had a little footnote or a little reference to say, of course, if there was any evidence of corruption, we might rethink this. And where were they? You know, they must have been living in a different planet than the planet I was living when they wrote that decision, because clearly money is about corruption. And it was already going on. But it's been lifted to a scale that we never anticipated. You know, Bitcoin is cryptocurrency has just elevated the mechanisms of corruption to a level that I think is a real, I mean, the one good thing about Trump, it should be a warning for every other country because it's been so corrupt that, and it's opened up so many new avenues of corruption that I'm sure there are people in every country around the world who are studying carefully what Trump has done, are thinking about how they can do it. And in some countries, they are actually doing it already. The other question,
Joe, I think we should
No.
leave the other question for an open conversation at the
Okay.
reception. We're out of time. It's a
Okay.
huge question, but a really important one. And forgive me for that. Sorry. But so I want to close proceedings. I want to say one thing about this book. Joe, you opened up by saying that you bring an economist's perspective to the questions of freedom. And you do, and very, very brilliantly in the book, but you do much more than that. And unusually for an economist, especially a Nobel Prize winning economist, Joe ventures far beyond economics into perhaps more interesting territory, an industry of ideology and fundamental human rights. So it's a very broad and deep and interesting book. Joe is going to be doing some signing over in the Paul Webley wing, and we invite you all over to that reception. So I'm just going to finish by thanking you all for coming and asking you to join me in thanking Joe.